Hello, this is Jerriton, and I greet you all in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ. In this video, I'll be analyzing my debate with Sheikh Inamullah Mumtaz and offering my responses to his arguments against Christianity. Many of his arguments I'll be addressing in this video are popular arguments Muslims often use against the Christian faith, and God willing, I will be showing how critics of Christianity go to extreme levels of abusing and distorting the Bible to make their point. The Bible commands Christians in 1 Peter chapter 3 verse 15 to always be prepared to give an answer, a defense to anyone who questions us, to give a reason for the hope within us. But the Bible says, do this with gentleness and respect. And it is with that gentleness and respect that I begin my response. On August 3, 2013, I debated Sheikh Inamullah Mumtaz, a Muslim apologist from Pakistan, on the topic of Jesus' crucifixion. The title of the debate was Crucifixion, Fact or Conjecture. The video has been uploaded to YouTube. Now, before the debate though, I gathered as much information as I could about my opponent's position. He had previously given me a soft copy of his book Paulinity, which I had read fully to analyze his arguments, and I should admit that it was the most unsophisticated and unscholarly book that I've ever read. And as I read through his book, I found out that my opponent had been heavily influenced by the late Muslim apologist Sheikh Ahmed Deedat. In fact, most of his arguments both in his book and in the debate with me was a copy from Ahmed Deedat's book titled Crucifixion or Crucifixion. So I got Ahmed Deedat's book and I read it as well, and the type of arguments advanced by people such as Ahmed Deedat, Zakir, Naik, and many others are shallow and lack sophisticated intellectual engagement in my judgment. And so, having read both the books, I could anticipate how my opponent would present his case against the crucifixion of Jesus. I knew that he wouldn't adhere to the topic of the debate, and hence in my opening speech I began by outlining a series of questions which our debate was not concerned with. In that I said that the debate is not concerned with questions such as the meaning of Jesus' death or the theological interpretation of his death, the errors and contradictions in the Bible, and so forth. This is because our debate topic was concerned with the question, was Jesus crucified? Is it really a fact that happened, or is it a guesswork, a conjecture? But he responded by saying that I was limiting him and telling him to proceed the way I wanted him to proceed. But that is not at all the case. I wasn't forcing my ways upon him. Rather, it was the very topic of the debate that limited both of us to take the narrow route. And as I pointed out in the debate, the topic was concerned with a historical event rather than a theological interpretation of that event. And to answer the topic of the debate, I argued that we are in need of some objective criteria. Because if I use the Bible to answer the question, it would amount to a logical fallacy called circular reasoning, and I would be guilty of using the Bible to prove the Bible. It would be like saying, the Bible says it, and therefore it's true. Now, obviously, such an approach would hardly convince any non-Christian, and yet, this was the approach Mr. Mumtaz wanted me to take in our debate. But precisely because such an approach wouldn't convince non-Christians, I used objective standards to prove the Bible's account of Jesus' crucifixion. The objective standards that I used are the tools of professional historiography, which historians use to study ancient figures. These criteria are universally available and can be used both by Christians and Muslims. But as I expected, Mr. Mumtaz never engaged with my case for Jesus' crucifixion. I provided 4 convincing reasons to think that Jesus' crucifixion is really a fact in history, but he did not respond to even one of them. So, what was Mr. Mumtaz's position, and how does he see the crucifixion of Jesus to be a conjecture? Interestingly, in the debate, Mr. Mumtaz hardly made his position clear. He brought several red herrings or irrelevant things in the debate. For example, he quoted Isaiah to say that there will be no other savior other than Yahweh, and that Yahweh is the only God, and that no God incarnate would come into the world. But in my response, I pointed out that this is a theological point which is irrelevant to our debate topic. I mean, think about it. So what if God incarnate will not come? I am not trying to prove that Jesus is God incarnate in this debate, am I? He then went to the Psalms to say that nobody can die for the sins of another. And in my response, I said that this is to do with the interpretation of Jesus' death and is therefore irrelevant to the topic of the debate. So what if Jesus did not die for other people's sin? I am not trying to establish that Jesus died for others' sins. I believe he did, but in the debate I wasn't arguing for it because that wasn't the topic of the debate. So even if Jesus did not die for other people's sins, that doesn't mean that Jesus did not die at all. At best, it would lead us to conclude that there was no need of the crucifixion. It wouldn't call into question the crucifixion itself. Like, for example, if a student writes a homework and shows it to his teacher, and the teacher looks at him and says, "But John, I did not tell you to write your homework. There is no need for having written your homework." Now, from this scenario, should we therefore conclude that John did not write his homework? Obviously not. The question, was Jesus crucified, has in the debate nothing to do with why was Jesus crucified. But the main thrust of the argument which Mr. Mumtaz proposed was to point to a few contradictions in the Bible and then conclude that Jesus' crucifixion is a conjecture. That's basically all he did in the debate. But Mr. Mumtaz and I had a post-debate discussion in Skype where we were discussing what we had debated earlier. And it was in this discussion that he made his stand clear. It was in this discussion that he gave me more information as to where he stands and how he reads the Bible. And so what I would like to do is that I would like to address his arguments under 4 headings. Number 1, the interpretation of 1 Corinthians chapter 15 verse 44. Number 2, the meaning of resurrection and its relevance to the crucifixion. Number 3, the crucifixion itself, where I'll be talking about the exchange theory which Mr. Mumtaz proposes. And number 4, regarding contradictions. So let's look at the first one more closely. The interpretation of 1 Corinthians 15:44. Paul here is talking about the resurrection, and Paul says in verse 44, "It is sown a natural body, it is raised a spiritual body." Now, in the post-debate discussion, this is what Mr. Mumtaz said, quote, "You said that the soul has a connection with the physical body, so Paul was talking that that connection must be cut off. He says that when body dies, the body remains in the grave and soul come out." End quote. So what he's basically arguing is this: when you die, your body is separated from the soul. That is what Paul is talking about here. It dies as a natural body having a soul, and then the spirit comes out of the body. This is what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15:44, and this is resurrection. So, resurrection means you're a spirit. And once he supposedly establishes that Paul meant a non-physical resurrection, he then goes to the Gospels, particularly Luke 24, shows that Jesus was not a spirit but had flesh and bones, and then concludes that Jesus was not resurrected. Because, according to his interpretation of Paul, resurrection means you become a spirit. So since Jesus was not a spirit after his death, it means that Jesus was not resurrected, and therefore he was not even crucified. In my response to this, I pointed out both in the debate and in the post-debate discussion that the word translated natural, psychetos, actually means soul. So Paul is saying that our present human physical bodies are soul bodies or soul-ish bodies. And what Paul means by this soul-ish body is that this present human body, which is made up of flesh and bones, contains and is animated or controlled by the soul. And if we carry the same meaning to the words spiritual body, it means that the spiritual body is also a flesh and blood body, which is animated or controlled by the spirit. So if we are to translate the words into contemporary English, it would read, the body containing the soul dies, the same body now containing the spirit is raised to life. The soul is what controls the body in the pre-resurrection state. The spirit is what controls the body in the post-resurrection state. Both are the same bodies. The only difference is that the latter is transformed to become a non-corruptible and immortal body, even though it is still physical. This is what Paul means in this verse. But Mr. Mumtaz calls my interpretation a lie. In his post-debate discussion, he said that I was, quote, giggling the games of words. I'm telling you, you're going to faint, end quote. So, let me prove that Paul is talking about a physical resurrection here. To understand this verse, we have to read it from the context. And the context begins from verse 39, 1 Corinthians 15, verse 39 forwards. Paul says, all flesh is not the same. Men have one kind of flesh, animals have another, birds another, and fish another. There are also heavenly bodies and there are earthly bodies. But the splendor of the heavenly bodies is one kind, and the splendor of the earthly bodies is another. The sun has one kind of splendor, the moon another, and the stars another. And star differs from star in splendor. So will it be with the resurrection of the dead. The body that is sown is perishable, it is raised imperishable. It is sown in dishonor, it is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness, it is raised in power. It is sown a natural body or soulish body, it is raised a spiritual body. Now notice that in the context, Paul is talking about heavenly bodies, the sun, the moon, and the stars, and the earthly bodies, the animals, birds, and fish. They all have bodies, Paul says, and obviously they are all physical. And then Paul says, so will it be with the resurrection of the dead, meaning that Paul's focus on the following verses is going to be on physical bodies. Paul says, it is sown perishable, it is raised imperishable. It is sown in dishonor, it is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness, it is raised in power. It is sown a soulish body, it is raised a spiritual body. Notice how Paul words it. It is sown, it is raised. It is sown, it is raised. The same it that is sown is the same it that is raised to life. And what is it in all these verses? We just saw from the context. It means the physical human body. So we can see that there is a continuity between the pre-resurrection body and the post-resurrection body. What is sown is what is raised. The body is sown, that same body is raised. Paul doesn't say that the body is sown and the spirit is raised. If he had said that, then I would be the first one to accept Mr. Mumtaz's interpretation. But Paul doesn't say that. Paul says that the body is sown and the body is raised. It means body. It is sown, it is raised. It's the same object that is sown and that is raised. And the context is clear that by saying body, Paul means a physical body. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 36, Paul clearly says, that which you sow, that is the physical body, is not made alive until it dies. Now notice what Paul is saying in the same context of resurrection. The physical body that is sown or that dies is not made alive, that is resurrected, until it dies first. Now notice what is made alive? The physical body is made alive. Only if your body dies will your body be made alive. This is what Paul is saying in 1 Corinthians 15:36. So it's clear that Paul is talking about the same body that dies and rises again. What goes down in burial is what comes up in resurrection. The body that dies is the same body that is raised to life in a transformed yet physical state. Now, let me strengthen my argument further. In many places such as 1 Corinthians 15:29, Philippians 3:21 and so forth, Paul says that our resurrection bodies will be like Jesus' resurrection body. This is what he says in Philippians chapter 3 verse 21. Paul says, he will transform our humble body to be in similar form to his glorious body, according to the working of his power, even to subject all things to himself. So the logic is this: what is true of our resurrection body is true of Jesus' resurrection body. That's what Paul means here. So, how will our resurrection body be? Let's read 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 53 to 54, where Paul is talking about our resurrection bodies. Paul says, for it is necessary for this perishable to clothe itself with incorruptibility, and this mortal to clothe itself with immortality. When this perishable shall clothe itself with incorruptibility, and this mortal shall clothe itself with immortality, then will be the word that has been written, death is swallowed up in victory. And as the historian Michael Licona has pointed out, quote, one can almost see Paul grabbing his arm as he emphasizes that it is this body that will put on immortality as one puts on a coat. A transformation of the corpse will occur, and it will be clothed with immortality and imperishability. End quote. And it is this description of Jesus that we find in the Gospels. Jesus, in spite of having a physical body with flesh and bones, was no longer confined to the laws of physics. The resurrection body of Jesus was possessed of powers that no normal human body possesses. Thus, in Matthew, when the angel opens the tomb, Jesus does not come out of the tomb. Rather, Jesus is already gone. Similarly, in Luke, when the Emmaus disciples recognize Jesus At the breaking of the bread, Jesus vanishes from their sight. And when the Emmaus disciples finally join the disciples in Jerusalem that evening, Jesus suddenly appears in their midst. John says that the doors were shut, but Jesus stood there among them. These weren't ante-mortem appearances. These were clearly post-mortem appearances. These weren't the appearances of a Jesus who had escaped the crucifixion, as Mr. Mumtaz alleges. These were the appearances of a Jesus who had been crucified, killed, and raised to life on the third day. Mr. Mumtaz deceptively ignores these supernatural properties of the resurrection body which the Gospels report, and takes into account only those that make him look like a mere mortal human being. This is the cherry-picking fallacy. You have to base your interpretation on everything that the Gospels say about the post-crucifixion Jesus, and not base your interpretation on one or two passages and pretend that that's all there is. Such an exegesis would amount to abusing and mutilating the text at its best. So it's clear that in 1 Corinthians 15:44, Paul is talking about a physical resurrection. The body that dies is the same body that is raised to life and empowered by the Spirit. Second, the meaning of resurrection. We've already seen that Paul is talking about a physical resurrection. But Mr. Mumtaz wanted me to prove that the resurrection means physical from a Jewish encyclopedia. And also in the post-debate discussion we had, I said that the Jews believed in a two-stage post-mortem life. That is to say, when you die, you enter the first stage of post-mortem life. This is what the Jews believed to be the afterlife, that is, the life that follows immediately after death. And in this stage of the afterlife, the Jews believed that your spirit would have been detached from your body and you would be living as a bodiless and a non-physical spirit. However, this is not resurrection. There was a second stage post-mortem life which the Jews believed would happen at the end of time, at the final judgment. And at this stage, the Jews believed that the spirit that had been separated from the body in the first stage post-mortem life would be reunited with the same body, and that body would be raised from the dead into a powerful body which will no longer die again. In this second stage post-mortem life, flesh and bones would be remade if they had been decayed or had been destroyed. This second stage post-mortem life is what the Jews meant by resurrection. This stage is not the afterlife. This stage is the life after the afterlife. In other words, it is life after death. Mr. Mumtaz said that I was playing with the games of words, and when I said that that the Jews did not have any concept of a resurrection that was to happen within history, because they believed in a general resurrection that was to happen at the end of time, he said that I was lying and that I was making these things up. So now I would like to prove all my statements from a Jewish encyclopedia as he insisted. Now before I do that, I have to mention this. Mr. Mumtaz showed me a website, www.jewishencyclopedia.com, where it says that the Slavonic version of the Book of Enoch has a resurrection without a body. To quote from the website, this is what it says, quote, "The author of the Slavonic Book of Enoch believed in a resurrection of spirits without a body. He nevertheless believed in a spiritual body, for he describes the righteous as clothed in the glory of God." End quote. But this is blatantly wrong. This is what the Book of Secrets of Enoch says. Let me quote it. Quote, "And the Lord said to Michael, Go and take Enoch from out of his earthly garments, and anoint him with my sweet ointment, and put him into the garments of my glory. And Michael did thus as the Lord had told him. He anointed me and dressed me, and the appearance of that ointment is more than the great light, and his ointment is like sweet dew, and its smell mild, shining like the sun's ray. And I looked at myself, and I was like transfigured, one of his glorious ones. End quote. This is from 22 verses 8 to 9. Now, notice what the text is saying. It says that God is commanding Michael to undress the garments of Enoch and anoint his body with sweet ointment, and then clothe him with the garments of his glory. It is clearly talking about the physical body being anointed and then being clothed with the glory of God. It is the transformation of the physical body. There is no resurrection of spirits here, as the website alleges. Then the website says, quote, "The authors of the Book of Jubilees and the Assumption of Moses believed in a resurrection of the spirit only, without a body." Well, this is also false. What does the Book of Jubilees say? This is what it says, quote, "And their bones shall rest in the earth, and their spirits shall have much joy, and they shall know that it is the Lord who executes judgment and shows mercy to hundreds and thousands, and to those who love him." End quote. And what does the Assumption of Moses says? This is what it says, quote, "And God will exalt you, and he will cause you to approach to the heaven of the stars in the place of their habitation." End quote. There is no mention of a resurrection here. Had Mr. Mumtaz looked into the references which this website gives, as I have done, he would have found out that contrary to what the website alleges, the references it gives talk about physical resurrections or no resurrections at all. There is no concept of a non-physical resurrection during or before the 1st century. Moreover, I should point out that this website has a 1906 outdated version of the encyclopedia. Scholarship has changed drastically within the 100 years from then, and hence not only is that encyclopedia outdated, it is also unreliable and false. Now let me provide a more contemporary Jewish encyclopedia which is far more reliable. The encyclopedia is titled Encyclopedia Judaica. It is a 17,000-page multi-volume book. It is the product of about 3 decades of study and research by about 2,200 contributors and 250 editors around the world. The first edition of this encyclopedia was published in 16 volumes in 1972, and the second edition was published in 22 volumes in the year 2006. And I am going to give you the evidence from the second edition of Encyclopedia Judaica about the meaning of resurrection. This is what it says. The second edition of Encyclopedia Judaica, volume 17, page 240. Resurrection. The belief that ultimately the dead will be revived in their bodies and live again on earth. Resurrection is to be distinguished from the belief in some sort of personal existence in another realm after death, that is the afterlife, or the immortality of the soul. Now notice what it says. Resurrection has to be distinguished from the afterlife or the immortality of the soul. The afterlife is not resurrection. Afterlife is the immortality of the soul, where you are a spirit. Afterlife is the first stage of post-mortem life, and resurrection is life after the afterlife, the second stage post-mortem life. Mr. Mumtaz said that I was lying. Well, here is your Jewish encyclopedia that confirms my statement. When the disciples of Jesus saw him in the upper room, they were terrified and thought that he was a spirit. Why? Because this is the afterlife existence. They did not think that Jesus was resurrected. They thought that Jesus was standing before them in the first stage of post-mortem life. And Jesus showed his flesh and bones, not to say that he had not been crucified and killed, but to say that he had passed through death and has entered the second stage of post-mortem life, which is what the Jews meant by resurrection. And the Jewish encyclopedia tells us to be careful to distinguish between the spirit stage from the resurrection stage. They are not the same. Becoming a spirit does not mean you are resurrected. So that is from a Jewish encyclopedia. Now let me prove it from the New Testament. We've already seen in 1 Corinthians 15 that Paul is talking about a physical resurrection. And Paul also teaches a two-stage post-mortem life. Let me prove that. Paul talks about this first stage post-mortem life in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 8. This is what Paul says. To be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. Paul is saying here that if you are absent from the body, that is, if your spirit or your soul is separated from the body, it means that you will go to heaven in a disembodied state and there you will be with God. But Paul does not say that this is resurrection. So what is resurrection? It's in many places. One of them is in Romans chapter 8 verse 11, where Paul says, quote, "If the spirit of him who raised Jesus from the dead dwells in you, then he who raised Christ Jesus from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies through his spirit who dwells in you." Notice what Paul says. The spirit of the one who raised Jesus from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies. That is resurrection. Life coming back to our mortal bodies. This is resurrection in Paul. The words first stage and second stage post-mortem life is not in the Bible, but the concept of a two-stage post-mortem life is clearly in the Bible. Now let me prove from the Old Testament that resurrection means physical. Daniel chapter 12 verses 2 to 3. Daniel 12, 2 to 3. I'm quoting this verse as quoted by the Jewish encyclopedia. This is what it says in Daniel. "And many of those who sleep in the dusty earth shall awake." Notice what it says. Many of those who sleep in the dusty earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and others to everlasting reproach and contempt. Then the knowledgeable shall shine like the brightness of the sky, those who justified many like the stars forever and ever. And in Isaiah chapter 26 verse 19, this is what it says. Isaiah 26:19. "Your dead shall live, my dead bodies shall arise. Awake and sing, you who dwell in the earth, for your dew is as the dew of the light, and the earth shall bring to life the shades." So it's clear that this is resurrection that the Jews believed. Bodily resurrection, the body coming back to life. And also this will happen on the last day. Jews did not believe that resurrection will happen during the normal course of history. Mr. Mumtaz called this a lie, but let me prove that to you now. Read John chapter 11 verse 24, where Jesus looks at Martha and says, "Your brother Lazarus shall rise to life." And Martha replies, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day." So when did the Jews believe that the resurrection would happen? On the last day. This is why the disciples, when they saw Jesus standing before them, thought that Jesus was a ghost, although Jesus did not look like one, because they thought that resurrection will only happen on the last day. So Jesus could not have possibly been resurrected. And that is why Jesus had to show his hands and feet and tell them that he had really been resurrected. And after he had showed them his hands and his feet, this is what Jesus says in Luke 24:46. Thus it is written, and thus it was necessary for Christ to suffer and to rise from the dead on the third day. But besides, even if we don't consider all these evidences which I've just given, we still cannot conclude that the disciples thought that Jesus was resurrected when they assumed that he was a ghost. Let me explain why. In Matthew chapter 14 verse 26 and in Mark chapter 6 verse 49, when Jesus walks on water and approaches the boat where the disciples were sailing, they were terrified to see Jesus walking on water, and they shouted that it was a ghost, a spirit. This is what Matthew 14:26 says. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, "It's a ghost," and they cried out in fear. Now, obviously, they did not think that Jesus was resurrected because they did not have any prior knowledge that Jesus had died. So, why did they think that Jesus was a ghost, a spirit? Well, Mr. Mumtaz says that in Luke 24, the disciples thought that Jesus was a spirit because they thought that Jesus was resurrected. But if that is the case, then he has to maintain the absurd interpretation that when the disciples saw Jesus walking on water, they likewise thought that Jesus was resurrected, which is absurd because the crucifixion scene had not yet taken place. So it would only be folly to maintain that if you are a spirit, it means you are resurrected. Another point that has to be mentioned here before we move on is that the Greek word for resurrection, anastasis, and its cognates could take two forms of coming back to life depending on the context. In the non-eschatological context, it means the coming back from the dead to this regular earthly life and resuming normal everyday activity. In the New Testament, Peter raising Tabitha from the dead, as reported in Acts chapter 9 verse 40, is an example of this type of resurrection where she returns back to the normal earthly life, but then she will die again. And Lazarus rising from the dead is another example of this temporary resurrection. However, when the same Greek anastasis or its cognates is used in an eschatological context, as it is used for Jesus, it means the return to a physical life in a glorious and immortal state, never to die again. But notice that both are physical resurrections. There was no concept of a non-physical resurrection in Judaism. The only difference is to be understood from the context in which the word is used. Mr. Mumtaz asked me that if Lazarus had been resurrected, then he should be alive today. But the context in which Lazarus was resurrected was a non-eschatological one. Lazarus was resurrected back from the dead to resume the normal earthly life. It is resurrection, yes, but it is a non-eschatological one. And the Jews were aware of non-eschatological temporary resurrections because it is mentioned in the Hebrew Old Testament in 3 cases where Elijah resurrects the son of Zarephath's widow in 1 Kings 17, and Elisha resurrects the son of the Shunammite woman in 2 Kings 4, and also the resurrection of a dead man when his body touches Elisha's bone as mentioned in 2 Kings 13. These are temporary resurrections that occur in a non-eschatological context. However, when Jesus talks about the resurrection, he was talking about it in an eschatological context, which would mean that resurrected people will no longer die. And Jesus' resurrection itself is an eschatological resurrection, as we saw in 1 Corinthians 15 and Romans 6:9. Okay, now let's come to the crucifixion. With regard to the crucifixion scene, Mr. Mumtaz has a very fantastic theory. He clings to Mark chapter 14 verse 50, which says that all the disciples forsook Jesus and fled. He then inputs his Islamic theology into the text by quoting Ibn Abbas, who was a companion of Muhammad, who said that Jesus was taken up to heaven before he was captured by the Romans, and another look-alike was made to stand in his place. Let us call this the exchange theory. To quote Mr. Mumtaz's words in the post-debate discussion, this is what he said, quote, "What point we Muslims make from this point in Mark chapter 14 verse 50 is this: we believe that this was the point when Jesus was changed." End quote. So he says that when the disciples left Jesus and ran away from the scene, that was the moment when Jesus was translated into heaven, and immediately someone else, a look-alike, which he assumes to be Judas, was made to stand in his place. So when the Romans come to arrest Jesus in Mark's Gospel, they arrest and crucify someone else. Now here is a timeline to better understand the event. Jesus and his disciples are in the Garden of Gethsemane. Soon they realize that the Romans are coming to arrest them. So all the disciples forsake Jesus and they all run away. So when Jesus was alone, he was taken up to heaven, and then immediately a look-alike, Jesus, was made to stand in his place. This is where the exchange takes place. So when the Romans come, they arrest the look-alike Jesus, crucify and kill him instead of the real Jesus. And Mr. Mumtaz thinks that this look-alike figure who was crucified instead of the real Jesus was actually Judas Iscariot, the one who betrayed Jesus. And would you like to know how Mr. Mumtaz comes to assume that the one crucified was Judas and not Jesus? Well, let me tell you how. He points to the two alleged contradictions of Judas' suicide, where in Matthew it says that Judas hanged himself, and in Acts it says that Judas fell headlong and died. And so he concludes that Judas did not commit suicide, nor did he die by an accident, but he was crucified instead of Jesus. This is what he says in his book, page 103. He says that the Gospel writers of the New Testament, quote, deliberately hid the fact that Judas was put on the cross, end quote. Now notice what this implies. It implies that Matthew, Mark, Luke and John knew that Judas was put on the cross, not Jesus, but they did not mention it. And so the question that we would like to ask him is this: how does he know that the Gospel writers knew that Judas was put on the cross? See, the Quran doesn't say it, nor does the Gospel of Barnabas, to which he appeals to, says it. By the way, the Gospel of Barnabas is a medieval forgery, which even Muslim scholars admit. This is what Cyril Gassi, in his book The Concise Encyclopedia of Islam, says, quote, as regards the Gospel of Barnabas itself, there is no question that it is a medieval forgery, end quote. So even Muslim scholars admit that the Gospel of Barnabas is a forgery. So how does he figure out that the New Testament Gospel writers knew the true story but deliberately did not mention it? Here is his answer. Quote, this is from his book, page 103. One writer says Judas Iscariot committed suicide due to his guilt, and another writer says that he was killed by an accident. So Mr. Mumtaz reasons like this: look, there are two conflicting accounts of the death of Judas by suicide. So this means that Judas was actually killed by crucifixion instead of Jesus, but the Gospel writers deliberately hid this fact. It's pinnacle of logic, I should say. Okay, now coming back to the exchange theory. When I asked him for evidence to back up his assertion that an exchange took place when the disciples all forsook Jesus and ran, he asked me to prove that the Jesus who was arrested was the same Jesus before the disciples all left him and fled. To quote his words, this is what he said: You first convince me that he was the same Jesus. When Mark says in 1450 that all forsook him and fled, now you please tell me, was that Jesus who continues after this statement or not? Now this is a typical example of a fallacy called shifting the burden of proof. It's like asking me to prove that an invisible pink unicorn exists in my room. Anyway, when I insisted him to provide evidence as to why he thinks that an exchange between Jesus and Judas or someone else took place and why he thinks that it was someone else who was crucified, he goes to Matthew chapter 27 verse 46, where Jesus cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And he then says, look, according to Christianity, Jesus came to die for the world. He planned to kill himself at the hands of the Romans. So why is Jesus saying that God had forsaken him if it was his plan to die in the first place? So since Jesus shows the sign of hesitation to die, it means that this person on the cross was not really Jesus, but someone else. So that's his position. Now, in my response, I would like to give 3 responses to this so-called exchange theory. First, I would like to point out that one of the most basic and an important rule of biblical exegesis, which is the critical interpretation of the text, is to interpret Scripture with Scripture. And if you're not going to follow this basic rule, it means that you are abusing the text. Whether you are a Hindu, a Muslim, or even an atheist, you cannot input your beliefs into the text and interpret it your way. For example, I have a Facebook friend named Selmer who happens to be a Hindu. He believes that all religions are one and true, and thus he uses all religious texts to say what his Hindu beliefs say. He believes that we humans are all gods, and he quotes the Bible, John chapter 14 verse 9, where Jesus says that those who have seen him have seen the Father God. And he thus concludes that we humans are all extensions of this one God, and so we are all equally divine. Now, if you read some of his posts on Facebook, you will get to know what he thinks about himself. In one of his Facebook posts, this is what he said, quote, "You don't know me and can't, but I am the knower of you all, 'cause I read your minds, hearts, thought. Distance doesn't exist, not for me. I can touch the one in Australia, Russia, USA, Egypt, or wherever. No games with me." End quote. So his argument is basically this. In John chapter 14 verse 9, Jesus says that those who have seen him have seen God. But Jesus was a human being. Therefore, all human beings are gods. Now this is a possible interpretation of John chapter 14 verse 9. But it is a false interpretation, because he is interpreting the Bible not with the Bible, but with his Hindu beliefs. And this amounts to abusing the text and breaking one of the most fundamental rules of biblical exegesis. Likewise, Mark's Gospel says nothing about Jesus being taken up to heaven or someone else being crucified in his place. And so you cannot input your Islamic beliefs into the Bible and interpret the text. The second response I would like to give is that the story as narrated by Ibn Abbas, where Jesus is taken up to heaven and someone else is made to look like Jesus, this story takes place inside a room, whereas in Mark's Gospel, Mr. Mumtaz maintains that this took place in the Garden of Gethsemane. So this couldn't have happened both inside and outside the room at the same time. It amounts to a contradiction. The third response I would like to give is this. Just as Mr. Mumtaz has proposed a fantastic theory that Jesus was not put on the cross, I propose a parallel theory that Jesus was put on the cross, using his same logic. According to Mr. Mumtaz, the reason why he thinks that it was not Jesus who was on the cross is because Jesus said that God had forsaken him. Let me just construct his argument in a standard form. Premise 1. If Jesus supposedly had been on the cross, he shouldn't have shown any hesitation on the cross. Because, according to Christianity, Jesus came to die for the world. It was his plan. Premise 2. The supposed Jesus did show signs of hesitation on the cross. Remember, Jesus said, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Conclusion: therefore, Jesus was not on the cross, someone else was on the cross. That is his argument constructed in a standard form. Now, in my response to this, my parallel theory is this. Listen carefully to this parallel theory. Immediately after Judas or whoever else was put on the cross had said that God had forsaken him, another exchange took place where that someone else was removed and the real Jesus was put back on the cross. Now I know this is an absurd theory, but hey, an absurd theory can only be defeated by an equally absurd theory. My evidence for this theory is going to be similar to Mr. Mumtaz's evidence. Jesus did not show any sign of hesitation on the cross after his initial cry that God had forsaken him. He seemed to be willing to die. Therefore, it was the real Jesus whom Christians believe came to die for the world. Here is my argument in a standard form. Premise 1. If someone other than Jesus was on the cross, then he should have shown signs of hesitation on the cross. Premise 2. After his initial cry of hesitation, Jesus did not show any sign of hesitation on the cross. Conclusion: therefore, someone other than Jesus was not on the cross. Only the real Jesus was on the cross. Now, in support of premise 2, I give the following reasons. Number 1. On the cross, Jesus prays to the Father to forgive his enemies, Luke 23:34, which parallels his preaching to love our enemies and to pray for those who persecute us, Matthew 5:44. 2. The thief crucified with Jesus acknowledges Jesus to possess a kingdom in paradise and asks Jesus to accept him when Jesus enters his kingdom, and Jesus accepts his request. This parallels Jesus' response to Pilate that he has the kingdom and it is a heavenly kingdom, John 18:36. Number 3. Jesus' words on the cross in John chapter 19 verse 30 is tetelestai, which means paid in full, or it has been accomplished. This statement of Jesus is the completion of Jesus' mission as mentioned in Mark chapter 10 verse 45, where Jesus says that he had come to give his life as a ransom for many. So looking back at my argument again, we saw 3 reasons in support of premise 2, that Jesus was not hesitant to die and that his words on the cross parallels his words which he had spoken before being arrested and crucified. All these show that the one crucified is the same Jesus who was there before they all forsook him and fled. So thus a second exchange happened and the real Jesus was replaced and put back on the cross. Now this is my parallel second exchange theory to Mr. Mumtaz's theory. But now let me go ahead and refute Mr. Mumtaz's theory. Recall the timeline in Mr. Mumtaz's theory. According to his theory, Jesus should have shown hesitation to die only after the disciples all forsook him and fled. Because in his theory, the exchange takes place only after they all run away. But Jesus shown his sign of hesitation to die even before they all forsook him and fled, where Jesus asks the Father to remove the cup of suffering if possible in Luke 22:42. So Mr. Mumtaz has to now maintain that the exchange took place before they all forsook him and fled. Otherwise his theory would fail. But he can't do that because everyone was there to witness the exchange if it had to take place, and the Gospels would have reported it. So in every way, his ad hoc exegesis of the text is flawed. The last point that I would like to address is that in our debate on the crucifixion of Jesus, Mr. Mumtaz appealed to peripheral contradictions surrounding the crucifixion narratives and then conclude that the whole crucifixion is a conjecture. The debate topic was Jesus' crucifixion, fact or conjecture. Now, what is a conjecture? According to him, contradictions means that it's a conjecture. This is simply wrong. Let me define what a conjecture is. A conjecture is a conclusion that is based on insufficient or incomplete evidence. But we have more than sufficient evidence to conclude that Jesus was crucified. I've outlined the evidences in my debate with Mr. Mumtaz, and the presence of contradictions don't necessarily mean that something is a conjecture. Georges Bataille, the famous French intellectual novelist, said this: "I believe that truth has only one face, that of contradiction." So, a contradiction doesn't necessarily have to be a conjecture. When we read the gospel accounts surrounding the death of Jesus, we see that these alleged contradictions are found only superficially. On the core, however, they all agree that Jesus was crucified and killed on the cross by the Romans. If one account says that Jesus was crucified and the other says that Jesus was not crucified, then that would be a contradiction at the core. But there aren't such contradictions. If there are contradictions, which I don't think there are, but even if we grant that there are contradictions, they would only be peripheral contradictions. And such peripheral contradictions do not call into question the core account of what the Gospels have to say. For example, when the Titanic sank, there were eyewitnesses who said that the ship broke in half and then sank. And then there were other eyewitnesses who said that the ship went down intact. Now this is a clear peripheral contradiction. The ship could not have remained intact and be broken in half at the same time. And yet nobody will conclude from these two contradictory versions that the Titanic did not sink, because all the witnesses agree that it did on this core, even though we may not be sure how the Titanic sank. To give an example from ancient history, think about the Great Fire of Rome that happened in AD 64, which no historian will doubt that it occurred. It is a historical fact. Yet, the reports we have are contradictory. Did Nero send men openly to torch the city, as reported by Suetonius, or did he do it in secret, as reported by Dio? Or was he not at all responsible for the fire, as reported by Tacitus? Did Nero watch the blaze from the tower of Maecenas, as reported by Suetonius, or from his palace roof, as reported by Dio? Or was he 35 miles away in Antium, as reported by Tacitus? You see, these are contradictions in the peripheral details, which we cannot reconcile. But all our sources agree that Rome burnt, and no historian would look at these peripheral contradictions and conclude that it's all simply a conjecture. Likewise, in the Gospels, the contradictions, if at all they are present, are only in the peripheral details. So by far, we should conclude that the peripheral details, such as the time of Jesus' death, the method of Judas' suicide, and so forth, are conjectures. But the core detail that Jesus was crucified is not a conjecture, because there is no contradiction at the core, and we have more than sufficient evidence to conclude that Jesus was crucified. So I think Mr. Mumtaz has failed terribly to maintain his position in our debate. His arguments in my analysis are childish and lack intellectual sophistication. He says in boast, Jesus was not crucified, and the Jews are guilty not for murder, but attempted murder. But he is wrong. All the evidences show that Jesus was crucified, and his arguments are full of errors and doubts, and he has no certain knowledge of it, and he only follows conjecture, guesswork, and fiction, for assuredly they killed him.